In this lesson, we're actually going to dynamically update the time that is displayed by using activity seconds to complete component after we select value by using this select box. And we're going to update this time every second once we start tracking the time for this particular activity by using this stopwatch. So for example, if I have started the timer for a coding activity, and as we can see, it increases every second, so that remaining time in this component should be decreasing every second as well. So first of all, let's recall how our stopwatch component works. And the component which is responsible for a stopwatch is called timeline stopwatch. So right here, when we click on the start button, this start function gets executed. And within this function, we set up the timer, which is supposed to run every second. So our reactive variable seconds, which shows time of the stopwatch, will be updated every second. Which means that every second we should also notify a parent component to update the time for a particular activity, and we're going to do this by firing custom event with the name update seconds, like this. And every time this event gets fired, along with this event, we're also going to send 1 second. So before going any further, let's register this event by using define emits macro. The event name will be update seconds, and validation function will be isNumber, which, by the way, is already imported within this component, so we can continue. So now let's talk about how we can notify a root component about the time change from timeline stopwatch component. In order to do so, timeline stopwatch component should fire an event to timeline item component. The timeline item component should fire a custom event to the timeline component, and finally the timeline component will fire a custom event directly to app component. As we can see, there are a lot of things we have to do in order to notify parent component about some action which has happened in one of the child components, which is actually deeply nested within components tree. But later we're gonna learn about more appropriate technique in this case, and for now, let's do this. Let's start firing custom events all the way to the root component. And once root component receives appropriate event from timeline stopwatch component, it is going to update activity seconds property of the timeline item object with the new time. Since when our stopwatch is running, this time will be updated every second. So therefore, custom event will be fired to root component every second. And then the component which displays the remaining time, activity seconds to complete component, can actually read updated value of activity seconds property of timeline item object and show updated time. So this all is going to happen automatically because our seconds diff computed property depends on timeline items array, and that means whenever one of the properties of objects stored within the timeline items array gets changed, this computed property will be recalculated, and therefore updated time will be shown by this component. So let's go ahead and start firing events. Everything starts from timeline stopwatch component. We have already registered update seconds event in this component, which by the way gets fired to parent component every second. And the next step would be to listen for this event from timeline item component. So let's register event directive with the name of event update seconds on this component. And once this component receives this event, we're going to fire another custom event. Let's call this event update activity seconds. And as part of this event, we're going to send amount of seconds as well that we have just received from timeline stopwatch component. And this amount of seconds is stored within a special event variable $event. And we're passing this value with this event up the chain to the parent component. And before registering the listener for this event in the parent component, let's declare update activity seconds event within this define emits macro. And its validation function we'll use isNumber, because amount of seconds that gets sent along with this event should actually be a number. And that's what we are verifying by using this isNumber validation function. So let's import this isNumber function from validators module, switch over to parent component, which in this case is the timeline component. And on timeline item component, let's start listening for update activity seconds event, like this. And once this event is received, we're going to send another custom event to the root component called update timeline item activity seconds to make it more clear what should happen when your root component receives this event. And the root component should know which exactly timeline item object we're going to update the time for, as well as amount of seconds by which we should update this time. So we're going to pass two pieces of data. First one will be an actual timeline item object, which is stored within timeline item variable in here. And the second parameter will be amount of seconds that we just received, along with update activity seconds event. So let's quickly write validation function for this new event, update timeline item activity seconds, within define emits macro. It is going to receive two pieces of data. First one will be timeline item object, and the second will be amount of seconds. Let's call this activity seconds. So let's validate this data separately. Firstly, we're gonna call isTimeline item valid validation function to validate timeline item object. And to verify that both of these validation functions will return true, we're going to wrap both of these functions within an array and call every method on this array. And this way we're going to verify that every value within this array will be true. So let's import missing validation function isNumber within this file. Then let's go to the app component. And finally, let's listen for that event, update timeline item activity seconds on the timeline component. And let's call custom function with the same name, update timeline item activity seconds, as a handler for this event. The function will be actually pretty simple. Let's start defining this function. Update timeline item activity seconds. It is going to receive two parameters. One of them will be timeline item object, and the second one will be amount of seconds. And all we have to do within this function is to actually update property activity seconds of the received timeline item object by adding amount of seconds that was received within the second parameter. So let's use shorthand for an addition and assignment at the same time, like this, by adding value of activity seconds variable to activity seconds property. And finally, let's go to the browser. Here we're gonna choose some time for the coding activity, let's say 1 hour, and then on the timeline page we're gonna start the timer for this coding activity. Going back to activities page, and let's verify that the remaining time will be updated every second, which is exactly what we're seeing. The time is decreasing. And if we're gonna choose less time that was already tracked by now, this block will be green and this time will be increasing. But there is actually one more case when we need to fire a custom event from timeline stopwatch component to the root component to notify root component about time change. So if in here we fire this custom event every second when our stopwatch is running, we're also going to fire the same event when we reset the time of the stopwatch. And to reset the time, we call reset function. For example, I'll choose any option in here. We have set our goal for this coding activity, and then if I start tracking time for this activity and reset the time after, then we will see that the actual time that activity seconds to complete component shows was not reset, but in fact it should reset back to 15 minutes. So let's think how we can fix it. As was said before, we also have to fire custom event update seconds, so let's copy this line and paste it within reset function. But this time we're going to update the time of timeline item object not by 1 second, but by the time which is stored within reactive variable seconds. And this variable stores current time of this stopwatch. So once we reset this time, we should subtract this time from timeline item object. So we're gonna have to pass negative value in this case. And here's how it is going to work. So for this particular stopwatch, we can see that it shows 7 seconds, and this value is stored within the seconds reactive variable within this component. And our activity seconds to complete component shows this time as remaining for the coding activity. And after resetting this time, we should actually subtract 7 seconds from this number, which is why we're actually passing 7 seconds with minus sign in front in here. So eventually this number will end up with an activity seconds parameter of this function within the root component, and when we're gonna add negative value to the activity seconds property, it is actually going to subtract this amount of seconds, which is exactly what we need. So let's check this out in the browser. Let's specify that we would like to spend on the coding activity 1 hour. And once we start measuring the time for this activity, we will see that the time is decreasing in here. And after we're going to reset this time, then on the activities page, we can see that track time was subtracted, and we got here initial value. Let's continue development in the next lesson.